Deep in the Appalachian hills, there's a family no map dares to mark. A family that has lived in the shadows for 7 generations, bound by a secret no outsider was ever meant to uncover. They weren't just isolated, they were trapped. Trapped by blood, trapped by a curse older than the hills themselves. Every child born carried the same dark fate, a genetic chain twisted with whispers of madness, strange deformities, and unexplainable deaths. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the house on the hill. How lights flickered at midnight, how screams echoed without a source, how shadows moved on their own. No doctor, no scientist, no priest could explain it, and those born into the family. They said the curse wasn't just a legend. It lived in their veins. It dictated their every heartbeat, their every decision, their every breath. Tonight, you're going to see what generations of blood can do when trapped by a curse that refuses to die. You're about to step inside the Appalachian nightmare, where family ties aren't just sacred, they're deadly. The cabin wasn't supposed to be there. Not on any map, not on any trail, not in any record of forest rangers or local hunters. It looked like something the mountains themselves had pushed out of their throat-old, splintered, leaning on one side as if it had taken one last breath before collapsing. The hiker first noticed it when the forest suddenly fell quiet around him. The wind stopped brushing the leaves, the birds went silent, and even the distant stream seemed to mute itself. It was the kind of silence that didn't invite curiosity but warned against it. Yet something about the crooked outline of the cabin tugged at him, pulling him forward even as his instincts whispered for him to turn back. Every step closer made the air feel colder, and the smell of damp wood and rotting earth grew stronger. The sunlight, which had been filtering through the trees all day, dimmed as though the canopy thickened just to keep this place in the shadows. The door was slightly open, swaying gently, even though there was no breeze. It creaked in a slow rhythm that didn't match the silence of the forest, almost as if responding to footsteps he hadn't yet taken. He paused, studying the exterior. Rotted boards, claw-like branches gripping the roof, windows so dirty they looked painted black. But what caught his eye were the carvings on the frame symbols he didn't recognize. Curling shapes that looked like they had been dug into the wood with something sharp and unsteady. They weren't decorative, and they weren't random. They felt like warnings left behind by someone who didn't care to explain them in words. He felt a sudden shiver run down his spine, but instead of turning away, he reached out and pushed the door open a little further. It moaned as it swung, the sound unnaturally long, like the cabin was exhaling after being disturbed. Inside, the darkness seemed thicker than it should have been, almost viscous, as if light didn't want to enter. He pulled out his phone, using the dim flashlight to cut through the black. Dust swirled in the beam, drifting like ash in the air. It looked like the cabin had been abandoned for decades, but there was a strange sense that the dust had only recently settled. The floor creaked under his weight as he stepped inside, and the temperature dropped sharply, making his breath fog. His light moved across the walls, peeling paint, rotted beams, and then the photographs. Dozens of them, tacked haphazardly onto the walls, each one framed by the same strange symbols he had seen outside. They were old, sepia-toned, some fading into near blankness, but the faces were unmistakable. A family, generation after generation, all sharing the same narrow features and pale, almost reflective eyes. He leaned in closer to one photo and felt his stomach twist. The faces didn't just look similar, they looked repeated, as if time hadn't changed them at all. No aging, no new variations, just the same blood forced to fold in on itself until the differences disappeared. He stepped back, feeling the wooden floor shift under him, and for a moment, he thought he felt movement deeper in the cabin. A faint shuffle, maybe just the building settling, maybe something else. The forest outside remained unnaturally silent, and that silence pressed in on the thin walls like a living thing. He suddenly understood he had found something that wasn't meant to be found, a place built to be swallowed by the mountains, but never quite forgotten by what lived within its shadows. The journal felt out of place in a cabin that looked like it hadn't seen life in decades. It lay on the table as if someone had just been reading it and stepped outside for a moment, though everything around it was coated in a thick layer of dust. Its leather cover was cracked and darkened with age, but when he touched it, The surface felt strangely warm, almost like a living pulse lingered beneath it. The hiker hesitated, his fingers hovering over the cover, unsure whether he was invading something sacred or something cursed. But curiosity, sharper than fear, finally pushed him to lift it. As he opened the first page, the spine groaned softly, releasing a faint whiff of mildew and something else, something metallic and sour like old blood. Most of the early pages were filled with neat handwriting, the kind you'd expect from someone who lived a quiet, disciplined life in the mountains. Daily entries about hunting, weather changes, births and deaths, small-town gossip, all ordinary, all harmless. Then halfway through, the writing changed. The lines became jagged, rushed, pressed into the paper so hard they almost tore through. Dates became inconsistent, some crossed out, others rewritten. The tone shifted from ordinary observations to frantic ramblings, and it didn't take long to see the pattern. Every entry circled back to the same warning, a curse tied to the blood of one family hidden deep within the Appalachian hills. He turned the page, and a loose sheet fluttered out and drifted to the floor. When he bent to pick it up, he noticed symbols drawn in charcoal spirals, broken circles, twisted shapes that resembled the carvings on the cabin doorframe. But this time they were paired with words. The seventh generation must not break. Her curse follows the bloodline. Purity is the prison, the hiker swallowed, reading the lines again, trying to make sense of them. He returned to the journal, and as he flipped through more pages, the truth unraveled in pieces. The family had lived in isolation for over a century, each generation forced to marry within its own bloodline to preserve what the writer called the original seed. At first, he assumed it was some fanatic belief in purity or tradition, but the deeper he read, the clearer it became that this wasn't a choice. It was an obligation, enforced by fear. The entries described a dying woman from the 1700s, someone accused of witchcraft, someone who had been wronged in a way the journal didn't fully explain. With her last breath, she cursed the family that betrayed her, declaring that their blood would fold inward 7 times, until the line becomes the monster it feared. The hiker felt a chill crawl up his arms as he imagined what 7 generations of forced inbreeding would look like, how the same features would repeat, distort, collapse into themselves. He remembered the photographs on the walls, the identical eyes, the elongated faces, the unsettling sameness. It wasn't genetics gone wrong. It was genetics trapped. He continued reading, and the entries became more desperate. The writer spoke of children born with twisted limbs, of voices echoing from the woods at night, of family members disappearing only to return months later, changed in ways he refused to describe. One line stood out more than anything. We are the 6th. The 7th is nearly complete. And when the 7th rises, the curse demands renewal. The hiker let the journal close, the pages snapping shut like a mouth sealing a secret. His heart thudded in his chest as he looked around the cabin again, feeling the weight of every photograph and every carving pressing into him. This wasn't just a family history. It was a warning written by someone who realized too late that a cursed dose in tea weaken over generations. If anything, it grows hungrier. The forest outside the cabin had been silent before, but now the silence felt heavier, stretched tight like something was holding its breath. The hiker tried to shake off the unease settling into his bones, telling himself it was just the eerie atmosphere of the abandoned cabin. But the moment he stepped outside and the door eased shut behind him, he felt the first prickling wave of awareness, like invisible eyes were dragging across his skin. He paused at the top of the small wooden step, listening. The woods weren't empty, they were watching. He scanned the tree line, letting his eyes adjust to the dimming evening light. Nothing moved, nothing shifted, yet the sense of presence grew stronger. The trees felt closer than before, the shadows thicker, as if the forest had changed shape while he was reading the journal. He took one slow step forward, then another, and that's when he heard it. A soft crunch of leaves, not far behind him. A deliberate sound, careful but not careful enough. He turned quickly, shining his phone's light between the trees. The beam jittered with his heartbeat. For a second, he thought he saw something, just a flash of pale skin or a shape leaning around a trunk, but it slipped back before the light fully touched it. His breath hitched in his throat. The silence deepened again, but now it wasn't empty. It felt occupied. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper of movement came from the left. He swung the light toward it, and once again something ducked away too fast to catch. Not an animal. Not a deer, not a fox. The movement was wrong, upright, human-shaped, but crooked in a way he couldn't understand. He felt the cold seep deeper into the air, as if whatever hid behind the trees brought the winter with it. He clenched the journal in his hand, feeling the pages flutter slightly with the windless chill. Another sound followed, a quick shuffle, wood snapping under weight. This time from a different direction. They were circling him. He swallowed hard and forced himself to listen closely. There was no heavy breathing, no rustling undergrowth, no footsteps running or crashing through branches. Whoever was out there moved with a strange, practiced precision, as if they knew exactly where to step to avoid making noise. But even the most careful creature leaves traces, and every now and then he caught a glimpse of something slipping between the trunks. A shoulder too narrow, a limb too long, a head that moved with an unnatural tilt. His instincts screamed to leave, to run, but another part of him, half fear, half disbelief, kept him rooted in place. The journal's words echoed in his mind. The 7th generation. The curse must be fed, the family preserved in isolation. The forest whispered again, this time closer, much closer. He lifted his light and caught a reflection near the ground, 2 pale points staring from behind a fallen log. At first he thought they were animal eyes catching the flashlight beam, but then they blinked. Slow, human. The shape crouching behind the log rose slightly, revealing the top of a head with hair, so thin it looked like wisps of gray straw. The eyes didn't break contact. They were the same eyes from the photographs inside the cabin, pale, unblinking, identical, his breath turned shallow. The figure slipped back into the darkness with a suddenness that made his stomach drop. And then, from deeper in the woods, another silhouette stood just long enough to be seen, twisted posture, elongated limbs, face angled downward as if studying him. They were everywhere now, drifting between the trees like fragments of the same shadow, watching, waiting. He realized in that moment that whatever bloodline the journal described, it wasn't just a story carved into old pages, it was alive. And it had survived by staying hidden for generations, moving through these hills like part of the land itself. Now it had noticed him, and it wasn't going to look away. The trail he followed wasn't a real trail at all, at least not one made by boots or mapped by rangers. It appeared almost naturally at first, just a thinning of undergrowth that seemed to invite him in. Under normal circumstances he would have ignored it, especially after what he saw near the cabin. But something about the direction those silent watchers had retreated toward tugged at him with a quiet insistence. It felt as though the forest itself was drawing a line for him to follow, narrowing his choices until there was only one path left. He took a cautious step forward, then another, and the deeper he went, the more the woods changed around him. The trees grew taller and closer together, their bark darker, their branches twisted into shapes that resembled hands curled inward. Moss clung to everything, stone, root, fallen trunk, as if time had thickened and settled like a blanket over the untouched valley ahead. Light struggled to break through the canopy, turning the world into shades of green and gray. It was still silent, but not with emptiness. It felt like a silence preserved, protected, enforced by something he couldn't name. As he descended, the incline steepened and the air became noticeably colder. Fog began to gather at his feet first, swirling around his boots like soft, ghostly tendrils before rising higher. It wasn't normal mountain mist. It gathered too quickly, thickened too fast, behaving as if it had a mind of its own. Every few steps he paused to listen to, make sure he wasn't being followed, but the only sound he heard was the crunch of leaves under his own weight and the faint dripping of water somewhere deep within the valley. Yet the further he went down the slope, the stronger the feeling grew that something was tracking his progress, not behind him this time, but ahead, moving just out of sight. The hidden path twisted more sharply now, snaking between crooked trees and sudden drops in the terrain. He had to steady himself against the rough trunks as the ground shifted beneath him, slick with damp earth and rotting foliage. The forest smell intensified. Wet soil, decaying leaves, and something else blended in a sour stench that reminded him of old wounds and neglected places. It clung to the air like a warning. He wiped sweat from his forehead even though the air was cold enough to sting his skin. The fog had climbed to his knees now, obscuring the forest floor, making each step a guess. Shapes seemed to float in the mist, tricks of light at first, then more defined outlines that dissolved whenever he blinked. Eventually the trees parted slightly, not enough for an open clearing, but enough to reveal the edge of a steep drop. He braced himself and leaned forward, gripping a tree trunk as he looked down. The valley below was unlike anything he had seen on any map or satellite image. A basin of thick fog stretched out like a pale ocean, with only the tips of rooftops barely visible beneath it. Old rooftops, wooden, primitive, a settlement hidden in the mountains, tucked so deep the world had forgotten it existed. Or maybe it had never been meant for the world at all. He felt his pulse race as he realized he was staring at the place the journal had been warning about, the place where the bloodline had lived, multiplied, and twisted into something the mountains refused to let go. He didn't know if the watchers from the woods were waiting for him down there or if something worse was expecting him, but the path behind him had already faded into the fog. There was no way back he could see, only downward, only deeper, only into the valley where the curse began and where, he feared, it still breathed. The fog in the valley clung to his clothes the moment he stepped into it, soaking through fabric as if the mist itself had weight. With each step the shacks he'd seen from above grew clearer, old wooden structures leaning against one another, patched with rusted tin and rotting planks, forming a cluster of homes that looked less like a village and more like a collection of forgotten scars on the land. They were built close together, too close, like whoever lived here feared the spaces between them. Smoke didn't rise from any chimney. No lantern glowed behind the grimy windows. It felt frozen in time, as though life had been paused in mid-breath. Yet something in the stillness hinted that the place wasn't abandoned at all, only waiting. He walked between the first pair of shacks, his footsteps muffled by the thick fog. The air here felt heavier, as if it resisted being moved. The smell was different too, not just damp wood and rot, but an unmistakable human scent mixed with something metallic, like blood left too long in the open. He caught himself glancing over his shoulder every few seconds, but the mist behind him always swallowed the path, hiding whatever could be following him. His nerves tightened with each step, but stopping felt more dangerous than moving. He noticed shapes behind the fog before he realized they were people. At first they seemed like shadows leaning against the shack walls, unmoving. Then one shifted slightly, and his heart jolted. A figure stepped forward just enough for the outline to sharpen. The person stood with an unnatural stillness, shoulders slumped, head tilted down in a way that made it impossible to see a face. His breath caught in his throat when he realized the figure wasn't alone. More appeared, emerging like ghosts from the mist, 5, 6, maybe more, each one pale, each one motionless, as if carved from the same fragile mold. He took another step, and the nearest figure lifted its head slowly. The face that emerged from the fog froze him in place. The features were too thin, stretched in ways that didn't look painful but wrong, as if the face had been shaped by hands that didn't understand human proportions. The eyes were the worst, part pale, almost silver, identical to the ones in the photographs from the cabin. Eyes without warmth, without emotion, without variation. Eyes that mirrored each other exactly, like copies of the same original. Another figure stepped into view, then another. They all had that same face, varying slightly in age, but shaped by the same repeating blood that had been forced to loop through generations. Their expressions didn't change, they didn't blink. They simply watched him with a cold, unified awareness that sent a chill deeper than the mountain air ever could. He raised a hand in a faint attempt to greet them or prove he meant no harm, but none of them reacted. No one moved closer or farther away. They stood in a half-circle around him, forming a silent barrier between him and the rest of the valley. He heard a soft murmur, then not from their mouths, but from somewhere behind them, deeper within the settlement. A shuffling sound, weak but intentional. The group parted just slightly as an older figure limped into view. This one's face was even more distorted, marked by the burden of too many repeated generations layered on top of one another. The eyes, though the same pale hue, held something different, tiredness, perhaps, or a flicker of fear. The elder stared at him as if seeing something long expected but deeply unwelcome. The hiker felt his chest tighten under that gaze, a silent message passing between them that had nothing to do with words. He wasn't just an intruder. He was something else to them, something they needed, or something they feared, or perhaps both at once. The pale-eyed figures closed their half-circle once again, and the elder's breath rattled softly in the cold air, as if he knew that the arrival of an outsider meant the bloodline's long, cursed rhythm was about to shift. The elder's breathing sounded like dry leaves scraping against one another, thin and raspy as he shuffled closer. The pale-eyed figures around him didn't move or react, but their presence tightened the air, making the fog feel almost suffocating. The hiker's pulse hammered against his ribs as the elder stopped only a few feet away. His face was a map of collapsed cheekbones too sharp, jaw too narrow, skin stretched thin over a structure that didn't seem entirely human anymore. But it was the eyes that locked him in place. Those same silver, unchanging eyes, but behind them, a glimmer of something the others did not have: memory, pain, restraint, as if he carried the burden of a truth the rest of them had simply learned to endure. The elder lifted a hand slowly, his fingers curled and trembling, and pointed toward a shack larger than the others. The gesture was neither welcoming nor threatening. It felt more like a weary surrender. The hiker hesitated, but the circle of silent figures shifted just enough to guide him forward, their expressions unbroken. He could feel their breathless stillness pressing against his back as he followed the elder. Inside the shack, the air was warmer but stale, thick with the scent of herbs, mold, and something acrid that prickled the back of his throat. The walls were lined with old symbols, drawn in faded charcoal and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Spirals, crooked lines, jagged marks, some matching the ones carved on the cabin he first discovered. Others were unfamiliar, crude, rushed, as if drawn in moments of desperation. The elder motioned for him to sit on a wooden stool, and he obeyed, mostly because he sensed that refusing would break whatever fragile calm was keeping him alive. The elder sat across from him with great effort, his bones cracking softly. He opened his mouth, and when he finally spoke, his voice sounded as if it had traveled a long distance just to escape his throat. The hiker struggled to understand at first, the accent thick, the words heavy with age, but slowly the meaning became clear. The elder wasn't simply recounting history. He was confessing it. He spoke of a woman from centuries earlier. A healer, some called her a witch, who lived among these mountains long before the family's presence. She had been known for her knowledge of herbs, remedies, and rituals that ran deeper than folk medicine. People traveled for miles to seek her help. But power, even benevolent power, breeds fear. And fear, in isolated communities, festers quickly. He told of a betrayal carried out by a family ancestor desperate to seize the woman's knowledge for himself. When she refused to share her secrets, he accused her of corrupting the valley. The people turned on her, and the family led the charge. Bound, beaten, and bleeding out on the forest floor, she spoke her final words sharp enough to cut through generations. "Your blood shall fold inward," she had said, her voice steady despite her dying breath. 7 times will it consume itself until the children of your name no longer know the shape of humanity. The elder's voice shook as he repeated her curse. He said the first generation dismissed it, believing the death of a witch had ended her power. But within a few years, something began to happen. Babies born with subtle deformities, minds slipping. Strange voices echoing in the forest. The family grew fearful, retreating deeper into the mountains to hide what they had become. They isolated themselves, believing that keeping outsiders away would halt the curse. But the curse didn't demand isolation. It demanded continuation, so they turned inward. Marriage within marriage, cousin to cousin, blood looping back on itself in a desperate attempt to hold the line unchanged. Each generation twisted a little more, their minds warping alongside their bodies. The elder said the family believed if they could carry the curse through 7 full generations without breaking the bloodline, the curse would end. But this was a misunderstanding. The woman hadn't promised release. She had promised transformation. Now the 7th generation lived. And the elder, with trembling hands and hollow eyes, declared that the curse hungered for something the family could not provide anymore. something fresh, something from the outside. And the hiker realized in that moment that he had not been followed into the valley by chance. He had been awaited, drawn in by a force older than the land itself, and the pale-eyed figures outside weren't guarding the valley. They were guarding him. The shack felt smaller the longer he sat in it, as if the walls were leaning inward, listening to every breath he took. The elder's confession still echoed in his mind, but before he could fully process it, the old man reached beneath the table and pulled out a wooden box. It was small, carved with the same symbols he'd seen on the cabin and on the valley walls. The elder placed it between them with a care that bordered on reverence or fear. Then, with trembling fingers, he slid it open. Inside lay pieces of bone, tiny, pale fragments that looked almost polished by time. They were arranged in a pattern he didn't understand, forming a shape that made his chest tighten the longer he looked at it. The elder spoke again, his voice cracking under the strain of memory. He said these were the remains of the curse's first child, the one born right after the woman's death. The infant hadn't lived long, but the family had kept its bones as a warning, a reminder of the price they paid for the betrayal. The bones were passed down through generations, used in rituals meant to keep the family from collapsing entirely. The hiker felt a wave of dizziness wash over him as he stared at the fragile relics. The elder continued, explaining that each generation used these bones to mark the moment the bloodline shifted to the next stage of the curse. The pattern they formed was not arbitrary, it was the shape of the curse itself, a twisted symbol that represented the inward folding of their lineage. But now that the seventh generation existed, the symbol was incomplete. The bones alone were not enough. The pattern required something else, something that did not come from their own blood. The elder's voice lowered to a whisper, and the hiker had to lean forward to hear him. He spoke of signs that had begun months ago, visions in the fog, shadows moving at the edge of campfires, voices speaking in tones that belonged to neither the living nor the dead. The seventh generation had reached maturity, but with it came an instability the family had never witnessed before. Two of the younger ones had disappeared into the forest and returned days later, moving with a disjointed rhythm, eyes unfocused, muttering fragments of the woman's final curse. The forest itself reacted to them, growing restless and unpredictable. Animals fled the valley entirely. Birds never crossed overhead. Even the ground felt wrong, softer in some places, as if the land rejected what had taken root here. The elder admitted they had tried everything, rituals, prayers, isolation, but nothing slowed the unraveling. And then the dreams began. He described them in a trembling murmur, dreams where an outsider entered the hills, drawn by a force beyond human will. Dreams where the curse reached out like a hand searching for something new to grasp. Dreams where the outsider's blood spilled into the valley, completing the pattern in the wooden box. And every dream ended the same way, with the pale-eyed family standing in a circle, watching the final piece fall into place. The hiker swallowed hard, realizing with icy clarity that he was the outsider from those dreams, the one the curse had summoned. The elder looked at him with an expression that was neither sympathy nor cruelty, but resignation. He said the curse had grown too strong for the family to resist anymore. The pale-eyed figures outside were not guarding him out of tradition or fear of strangers. They were the instruments of the curse, compelled by something older than themselves, moving with the inevitability of a tide. Then the elder's tone shifted, soft, desperate, almost pleading. He leaned closer and whispered that the ritual didn't have to end the way the curse demanded. There was one chance only to break the cycle. But it required him, the outsider, to face the seventh generation himself, not with violence, not with escape, but by confronting the source of the curse buried deep within the valley, a presence that had whispered through blood and bone for over 2 centuries. Before he could ask what that meant, a sound outside shook the shack, a soft thud, then another. Slow, rhythmic, getting closer. The pale-eyed figures were approaching, forming their silent circle again, as they always did when the curse needed something. Only this time, the seventh generation was with them. As the final pieces of the truth fall into place, the weight of the entire secret becomes almost suffocating, pressing down on every character involved as if the walls themselves are inching closer with every breath they take. And what makes this revelation even more terrifying is not just what happened in the past, but what it means for the present. Because once a curse is awakened, it doesn't simply disappear, it attaches itself to the bloodline, to the land, to every name written in the family Bible. And now that the hidden chamber has been opened after more than a century of silence, the thing that was trapped inside, whether a spirit, a presence, or something far worse, has begun to move freely again, threading itself into the cracks of the house, slipping through shadows, listening through the walls, exactly like it once did when the family elders first made their pact, and the moment the old ledger's diaries and forbidden documents were exposed to daylight. Something ancient stirred, leaving behind signs that can no longer be dismissed as coincidences, from the sudden temperature drops to the faint claw-like marks appearing on wooden beams to the eerie sensation of someone watching right over your shoulder, even when the room is empty. And as each entry in the cursed ledger is read aloud, the air thickens as though the house is reacting, remembering, almost warning that these words were never meant to be spoken again. Especially the final vow written in a trembling hand, sealed with a symbol burned into the parchment, a vow that promised eternal protection in exchange for eternal servitude. And now that vow has been broken, because exposing the truth is the same as undoing the binding, meaning whatever was once controlled no longer is. In the deeper they dig into the origins of the pact, the more horrifying it becomes to realize that the family never had full control in the first place. They were merely pretending, believing their rituals kept the darkness contained, when in reality the darkness simply allowed them to believe that, waiting patiently, generation after generation, for the moment the seal would weaken. And now, with the discovery of the chamber, the unraveling of the pact, and the retelling of the once forbidden story, that moment has arrived, leaving the present generation trapped between two impossible choices: to confront a force far older and stronger than they ever imagined, or to run and risk letting it follow them beyond the boundaries of the old estate, because once a curse is awakened, it doesn't stay confined, it spreads, attaches, learns, and hunts. And as the house grows colder, the lights flicker, and the sound of something crawling behind the walls gets louder. The chilling realization hits that the story they thought they were uncovering wasn't a closed chapter. It was a warning, a prophecy, a cycle waiting to restart. And by opening the chamber, by disturbing the silence, and by speaking the family's darkest truth out loud, they have not only stepped into the past, but invited the past into the present, igniting a chain of events that can no longer be stopped, leaving them with one final question echoing louder than their own heartbeat. Now that the curse has awakened and the pact has snapped, will anyone make it out before history repeats itself? So, if you want the next part of this terrifying mystery, then don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.